Hello, y'all. I've somehow ended up at Yoshi's Island, the racetrack, not the video game. I don't know how either. Last I remember, I was hiding out in the woods, being hunted by. Oh, they found me, it seems. Well, while I'm here awaiting my eventual demise, I might as well pass the time by talking about retro tracks, right? Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has an absurd amount of retro tracks. I'm sure you already know this, considering it's been the most recent console entry since 2014. Today, I'm going to be going from the usual 16 retro tracks to a whopping 51 from this game, an absolutely monumental amount from this franchise. And there's technically even more than that, but I decided not to include them because I didn't feel like it. But enough with the yapping, we've got 51 tracks to cover and I'm already regretting my decision, so let's just get into it. There's already 4 other videos in this exact format on my channel that do the exact same thing as this one, but for different Mario Kart games. But for those of you that are new around here, I'll go over the system one last time because there is no way in hell that I'm doing this for Mario Kart Tour. We start with a brief little blurb on the unlocking requirements just for the fun of it, and then we go over each track individually, discussing its overall quality, how much sense it makes for the roster, and how well it does as a remake, before giving it a tier ranking of either S, A, B, C, or D, and then giving the overall retro selection a score from 1 to 10. To keep things interesting, I go in the order of the games for these videos, and occasionally I have people who anonymously responded to a Google form give opinions on tracks as well, just to get some differing or reaffirming opinions. And now, let's dive into the unlocking requirements. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is different from every other game in the franchise because it doesn't have any unlockable tracks. Well, the Booster Course Pass is technically unlockable with a purchase of about $25 USD, and that's with over half the list, but I'm not sure that would actually qualify under the term unlockable. Of course, the original Mario Kart 8 on the Wii U did have unlockables similar in style to Mario Kart 7, in addition to even more DLC that got included in the base game of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which is the game that we're actually talking about. While not having any unlockable tracks does kinda suck from some perspectives, I've gotta be honest, this video was so much easier to do thanks to the fact that I didn't have to grind out all the unlockables. Looking at you, Super Circuit. But now, we can finally start the list off with our SNES tracks. Our first entry is Donut Plains 3, a track that I think gets way too much hate just because it isn't super flashy like some other SNES tracks. I think this track's greatest strength is its simplicity, especially with how they handled it as a retro track. Let's try driving through the water is such a simple idea on paper, but then when you actually play through it, it's so freeing and thrilling to just ignore the main part of the track and take an alternate route through the water instead. And to add on top of this, the track is absolutely gorgeous, with some particularly amazing looking water as well. My only criticism is that the Monty Moles are less compelling as hazards overall, but I recognize that having them latch onto the cards like they did on the SNES would probably be a technical nightmare, and they're still fine as is, and I think as normal hazards if they hit while also leaving underground trails that you can trick on. I'm gonna give this track a B tier ranking. It's a track that I find pretty enjoyable, even if it isn't too spectacular. A track that is spectacular, however, is SNES Rainbow Road, marking itself as the second track of the second retro review video in a row. I promise you I didn't plan on that happening, it just happened. There's not too much different from its previous appearance in Mario Kart 7, but the main thing I want to talk about is the visual presentation. This track is so much better looking in glorious HD. The colors all pop out of the screen, there's a nice glow effect from the road, there's a much cleaner looking background, and they didn't forget the color red this time. How neat. I still find tricking off of the shockwaves made by the Super Thwomps really difficult and annoying for some reason, but it's really not that big of a deal and doesn't change the fact that it's still a great time to drive on. It gets itself another A tier ranking. Anyways, next up is Mario Circuit 3. It's different from the rest of the SNES tracks in the game because it's cringe. I gave credit to the layout back in its segment in the Mario Kart Wii video, but the super tight U-turn on the track is absurd sometimes, and now I'm questioning how much of the track in Wii was fun in and of itself, and how much was fun because of Funky Flame Runner. Adding on to this is this track's horrid visuals. Take everything nice I just said about Rainbow Road and invert it, and that's how I feel about this track's looks. More than anything else though, this track was by far one of the worst choices to bring back for the BCP, and any other SNES track would have been more fun and interesting. This track is a D tier. I hope no one was surprised by this, which I think might not be the case for our first anonymous review of the video, who says of this track, of all the retro tracks, I feel this one gets a lot of love because of its seniority from Mario Kart Wii. It's as simple as it gets. Some basic drifting here, a good mushroom cut at the end there. You can't really go wrong if you want a quick race. I don't think this track actually gets a lot of love from the community, as much as it gets picked constantly because everyone thinks they can just cheese out a win by bagging, but fair enough otherwise, I guess. On a vastly different note, here's Bowser Castle 3, which is far and away the best SNES retro track of all time. Who would have guessed that actually adding dramatic elevation changes to a normally flat track would make it better? But this track doesn't just add elevation for the sake of it. It enhances this track's already great layout, already focused on split routes, with even more options, such as a section where you can drive on top of some walls instead of picking one of the main routes from the original. There's also tons of hazards everywhere, and they're placed in incredibly smart positions, such as a lava spire that can poke out from the most inward path at the beginning split path section, or some thwomps at the very end that are only in the way when they're in the air instead of on the ground like most thwomps. And then there's the visuals, which, despite being simpler due to being in the BCP instead of the base game, are still absolutely phenomenal. Everything on the track glows orange from the lava that's all over the track, the bricks with their cracks and the metal grates add to the rush of racing through this track, and the background with the volcano is equally as threatening. Ultimately, with everything this track has going for it, it's an easy S tier for me. This track is fantastic in every way, and this is what I expect to be the new goal for retro tracks in the future. And so does our next anonymous source, it seems, because they say about the track, possibly one of the best remade tracks for 8 Deluxe. It took the simplistic SNES tracks and amped it up to a beautiful modern standard. I vote for it every time online. I'd recommend voting for other tracks in this one just to spice things up, but if you were to pick one track to constantly vote for, this is far from the worst one in that regard. Next up, we have the N64 tracks, and first up from them is Toad's Turnpike. I used to despise this version of the track, but then I played the original, and now I just don't care about either version. You kinda just drive around a figure 8 and avoid some cars. I like that the cars are easier to manage in this version, I guess, that's kinda nice. I don't like that the track is just another night track now though. I really like the original skybox. You can drive on the walls in some parts now. It's really slow. Don't drive on them. Just avoid the cars. It's not that hard, and it's much faster. The track seats here. I just don't have any strong opinions here. A track I do have pretty strong opinions on, however, is Royal Raceway, which I believe to be the single best circuit track in the entire franchise. The layout is fantastic, nailing the difficulty it was aiming for with turns that feel super satisfying to take, and a nice little addition in the form of a glider, replacing the first ever super big jump with a well-suited new mechanic. The track also looks gorgeous as well, with the pinks of the sky and the cherry blossoms and the greens of the grass and trees working together to make something very pleasant on the eyes. What makes it the absolute best circuit track ever, however, has definitely got to be my massive beach bias. I know the biggest complaint against this track is that you can't drive up to Peach's castle anymore, but be honest, did anyone ever actually go off track to visit the castle in the middle of a serious race? I don't think so. In fact, I'm willing to bet that the only reason you can even go there is to make the awards ceremony cutscenes work properly in that game, and if it could have been separate or blocked off on the N64, it would have been. Anyways, this track's great, I really enjoy it, and it's a high A tier. It's still a circuit track, but man is it a great one. Next up from the 64 is Yoshi Valley, which I think is a pretty cool track. Its main gimmick is that there are just a ton of alternate routes, and it can be fun to take different ones. However, that also comes with a pretty big caveat. It quickly becomes apparent that the fastest route is to just always take the leftmost path over the bridge, and it's not very difficult at all once you get used to the game. But there's still some merit there. If everyone takes the bridge, which happens on the rare chance this track gets picked online, then it becomes very chaotic very quickly, and that means sometimes it's better to take a different route to avoid the chaos and potentially come out ahead. So the gimmick isn't entirely wasted. And in addition, the track itself has great visual presentation, and the hazards, while a bit lacking in the difficulty department in my opinion, are still interesting and add to the track overall. I think I'll put it in the same tier as its original version, that being B tier. While it unfortunately doesn't use its own idea very well, it can work well enough, and the rest of the aspects of the track are putting in great work. And now we get to Rainbow Road number 2 of the video, and Mario Kart 64's rendition of the track is super divisive in both of its appearances. I think the best place to start is with why it's divisive, and that's with the gameplay. The original version is simply way too long and uninteresting at 3 2-minute laps, and the remake is just way too short and uninteresting at 1.5 minute segmented lap. Seriously, in those lap count swap positions, I think there would be far less complaint about both of these tracks. As for more about the remake specifically, while I think the length is better even in its current state, I can't defend the nerf to its difficulty, especially with the chain chomps. I love how they went backwards on the track and acted like little jump scares on the 64, with their movements from side to side keeping them a genuine threat even after they spawn in ahead of you. In the remake though, they're essentially stationary and pretty easy to avoid unless you just happen to get unlucky with the timing. But back to the positives, we have the visuals, and yep, this is one of SNES Rainbow Road's biggest rivals for best visual glow-up in the franchise. The colors are all so vibrant, the lighting is fantastic, anti-gravity is used to perfection, and there's a magical train throwing coins onto the track. I don't fully understand why that last one was added, but I'm here for it. While I love looking at this track, I can't say that I really enjoy playing on it, which is why I think this track, much like Yoshi Valley, sits with its original counterpart in B tier. If it were longer or had the original chain chomps, it would be A tier, and if it had both, it would be an easy S tier. But alas. Returning to the BCP, we have Choco Mountain, which was my favorite track in its original game. Unfortunately, in this game, it has taken just a bit of a hit in my opinion, leaving it now second to the greatest circuit track of all time. But more on that later. First off, the positives. I'm really happy with what they did to this track layout-wise. Adding a glider section was a great addition that removed the threat of being set backwards on the track, which was a hazard I never thought was a good fit for a Flower Cup track. And the extended cave section is a great change of pace visually that looks pretty nice, at least for a Wave 1 track. However, those very visuals are what lowered this track below Royal Raceway for me. While that track only benefited from its HDification, Choco Mountain got hit with the ugly rain everything that isn't the cave section. I love this track because of the Choco part of the mountain, and now this track just doesn't look like chocolate anymore. While I appreciate that I decided to go bold with a different aesthetic, I think it was ultimately a hindrance instead of a boon. It's still an A-tier track, one that I will always enjoy playing on, but this track could have been even more than what it already is. And last but not least with the N64 tracks, we have Calamari Desert, which has gotten quite the glow up since its last appearance. Making the track function like a Tour City track does so much to make the track better that it's absurd. It helps break up the boring layout, it creates a new set piece to drive through, it makes the train a more threatening hazard for more of the track, and it makes the mini-map look identical to how it looks on the 64. I never understood why it looked like that when you couldn't drive on too much of the tracks without going out of bounds, but I digress. When this track does suffer a bit visually because it's in the BCP, it's honestly not super noticeable, and the track still looks nice with its orange sands. I think this track is a solid A tier. I am happy with this modernized train course. However, our anonymous source is not, saying, first of all, this track is overall better than both the N64 and 7 versions. Obviously, I much prefer the lap change because now the train feels like an actual hazard now, rather than the rare occurrence of it blocking you once a race. Plus the race is over quicker, so it is more intense. However, one thing I do not like is the music. I much prefer that soothing whistle than the brass instrument screaming down my ears. Bottom of C tier, better than top of D tier. It's still Calamari Desert at the end of the day. I agree with the first half of it, but as a former trumpet player, I'm legally obligated to prefer the brass to the whistle, and I think the changes are enough to really elevate the gameplay of the track, but still, a fair opinion on the train course. Next up, we get to our GBA tracks, which should be quite interesting given this game's efforts to modernize them similarly to SNES Bowser Castle 3. However, our first stop is Mario Circuit, and this track really doesn't have much going on. There's an anti-gravity section that's kinda, oh, it's done now, back to flat boring road now. Yeah, I think that section of the track gets way too much focus on it by the community. It helps, certainly, but there's only so much you can do when you only raise one turn in the straightaways before and after it by 45 degrees. The rest of the layout is just a pretty bland group of turns with one random off-road glider section tacked on, and while the track certainly looks nice, it's pretty much just road, grass, and trees. It doesn't do anything wrong, but it's not spectacular by any means, so I think it belongs in C tier. Now we have what is potentially the most controversial remake of all time, that being Cheeseland. The original Cheeseland is my favorite track in all of Super Circuit, and I am not a particularly big fan of this track's decision to completely overhaul it visually. I love the moon aesthetic of the original. The moon is made out of cheese after all, and while the remake isn't just a desert like some people say, the notes it does take from said desert tracks and other more nature-themed tracks like Yoshi Valley just don't feel as interesting compared to what the original had. And while I'll applaud the use of anti-gravity and verticality in general, especially with the massive shortcuts that seem like a great homage to Super Circuit's insane shortcuts, it feels really rough to drive on sometimes, especially with those holes in the ground. I understand why they're here, but it feels like they're placed in spots specifically designed to mess people up, and I don't like it very much. And last but not least, there's the removal of the perfectly fitting mice on the track, which I think were a fantastic hazard in the original, in favor of boring old chain chomps that aren't interesting to deal with and can be found on any old track. I understand liking the track, but to me, this track feels like it made a series of trade-offs that just didn't work in its favor. And I would have preferred a completely flat version of the track that remained faithful to the original theming-wise over this modern one. I think it belongs in C tier, for cheese. An anonymous source says about this track, GBA Cheeseland is a bit of an interesting one to me. On the one hand, I think the aesthetic is worse than the original, but otherwise I think it's the definitive version. The track still resembles cheese, even with it looking more like a desert than like being on the moon, and also has the better gameplay, which I guess is obvious since the original was on the Game Boy Advance, while the remake is on both the Wii U and Switch. There's some shortcuts that are satisfying to pull off, especially when you have mushrooms, and it's just an overall great time to race on. It makes me hungry. I appreciate the nuance of this review, even if I ultimately disagree with some of these points. Next up, we have quite the interesting case in Ribbon Road. I'm not sure how to feel about this track. On the one hand, much like Cheeseland, it sacrificed everything about the original track. It's practically impossible to tell that this is the same track, except for the fact that the layout is in vaguely the same shape as the original. However, I think there's quite a few things going in its favor compared to Cheeseland. First of all, I don't feel as strongly about the original. I like it quite a lot, but it's not one of my all-time favorite tracks in the entire game, much less my number one. But more importantly, the changes they made to the track feel like either about equal trades or just straight up benefits. It's hard to beat the original's unique and engaging setting in a mysterious land with giant presents everywhere, but I'd say the new setting of a giant bedroom is almost equally as unique and engaging. At least up until Squeaky Clean Sprint came along and stole its thunder. Changing up the coloration of the track from the original plain red to a tricolor of red, green, and blue does a lot to spice up the track. In addition to the giant Mecha Koopas functioning as hazards in the green section, a wavy road for parts of the blue section, and the glider leading back into the red section at the end of the track. However, much like several other tracks on this list, I find that this track makes changes that ultimately put it at near the same place as its original version. I'm just not that big a fan of completely changing everything about the track, especially because the original setting was so unique. It's an A tier for me. I want to like this track more, but I don't like that this track shares so few similarities to its predecessor. Our anonymous source disagrees, however, saying this is how you do a GBA retro track, a sheer evolution of the original concept and just one of the most ingenious Mario Kart tracks overall. I suppose this is just a difference in opinion on how retro tracks should be handled, I guess. And following that up with a similar problem to the last two, but much worse, we have Sky Garden. The theming for this one is vaguely similar to its original version. It's not a one-to-one comparison by any means, but I could see the connection between the two. However, where this track truly suffers is with its layout. It's barely similar to its original counterpart, with some very notable removals without much to replace them. Several turns are missing, but perhaps most importantly, almost every single cool shortcut has been made lamer or just outright removed, which really hurts because shortcuts were the soul of both Sky Garden and Mario Kart Super Circuit as a whole. While the elevation changes and Adam Randy Bouncy Mushroom and Glider Ramp are nice additions, they just can't make up for how much of Sky Garden was lost in translation to Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, making this a real fall from grace after its standout appearance in Mario Kart DS's retro selection. Oh, and it was also in Wave 1 of the BCP, so it looks ugly too. This track gets an easy D tier from me. And our anonymous source concurs, saying, "So here I go. The new remix of this track song is phenomenal and is very upbeat with its style. Like it is happy to be back in a Mario Kart game. While the tour version is a modern take on a classic." Okay, now we talked about the layout and aesthetic changes. What on earth happened here? Do we blame tour limitations so we couldn't get a proper remake like Cheeseland or Ribbon Road? Or was it just a simple creative decision? Either way, this track was done dirty in Tour and 8 Deluxe. It is a shame how they cut this track in half and just added a basic U-turn towards the end with no anti-gravity. The new aesthetic is also a letdown because it strips all the original green veins and driving on clouds to driving on an orange brick road and no more cloud shortcuts. I keep it short and say this is up there as by far the weakest retro remake, but not the worst because it is technically still fun to play, but just not challenging or engaging enough to remember. Nowhere near as hard or challenging as it was in the Lightning Cup. Nothing about the track screams challenging, or Sky Garden. A bit harsh to me, but hey, the criticism is valid. Well, now that I'm done with that, we can move on with a much more positive note to Snowland. This is the first time that I think a GBA track in this game got a meaningful and unambiguously positive update, and a lot of that comes from the fact that the original version had the screen shake and this one doesn't. I actually never saw this as too much of a problem, and I think it might be an issue of more people playing through the NSO expansion pack and therefore playing it on a much bigger screen, making it a lot more noticeable than on the actual GBA, but I digress. The other big change is that the track has a ton of elevation changes now, and unlike the previous track, it retains a very similar layout to its original incarnation, only losing a few alternate routes in exchange for the biggest shortcut in the entire game. The snowmen and penguins from the original remain good hazards, especially with the penguins moving along the track to make them more dynamic hazards, and the fact that some item boxes move along the track in some parts is a great addition as well. Ultimately though, there's really one thing holding this track back. Despite how good it is, it's still pretty much just a nice track, and there's only so far you can go with one without doing something drastic like, say, Mount Wario did. It's for that reason that I think this track is only B tier. Still a good course, but not as special as some others. Next up, we have Boo Lake, which, much like Snowland, was bad in its original appearance but has gotten quite a nice remake in the BCP. However, I think Boo Lake has an advantage for a couple of reasons, the first of which being anti-gravity. While it's not the most extreme use of the feature, considering that Tour needed the track to function without it, it's still plenty noticeable and greatly appreciated, as it makes this haunted track feel warped and aged, while also adding some always enjoyed elevation to the latter half of the course. The visuals are also pretty nice, making the track feel spooky without going too far for Mario Kart standards. And they also did the impossible and added the titular lake, giving it another new mechanic in underwater driving that fits perfectly in the track. I think this is the best true remake of any of the GBA tracks, and I think it deserves a solid A tier. And following that performance, we have Riverside Park, which I believe to be one of the best looking tracks in the entirety of the BCP. Seriously, this track looks almost on par with the base game visuals, which is impressive considering Sky Garden came out about a year prior to this track. But this track isn't just all style and no substance. The gameplay here is quite nice, especially with the Patuis that move along the track holding up bananas and mushrooms. They make for great hazards that can even be used strategically to get more hazards on the road or give out a handy speed boost when needed. I also appreciate the design choices made for the update, especially in regard to elevation changes. Adding in another bridge to make a jump feel more natural is a great addition, but the best addition has to be the cave section that dramatically raises the final 270-degree turn and makes the whole track feel a lot more climactic in its ending. However, my major complaint, as it tends to be with these GBA tracks, is the layout. The first half of this track is vastly different compared to the original, and in my opinion, it takes a hit because of that. However, the changes aren't too much of a loss compared to some other GBA tracks that I can think of. The back half of the track is the same as before, and ultimately I think this track puts in enough work to justify those losses. And for that reason, I think this track is an A tier track. And last but most certainly least for the GBA tracks, we have Sunset Wilds, which is in contention for the single worst retro track in the entire franchise. There's so much wrong with this track that I legitimately could make an entire video talking about how bad this track is. And I will do so sometime next year, so stay tuned for that video. Anyways, yeah, track sucks. Plenty of other people have already talked about why it sucks. It's D tier, worse than the entire game. Give us back the sunset, Nintendo. Moving on to an anonymous review summarizing it rather well. What happens when you bring back a fan-favorite desert track and strip it away of its own unique identity, cut it short, and remove lots of turns and an entire section while the visuals are just mildly improved? Well, you get a Sunset Wilds but the sun doesn't set, it is extremely easy, it is aesthetically boring to look at, short, and offers nothing unique in return. So you get a track that just feels dead to drive on and honestly feels like a track that wasn't supposed to be in the game. I can forgive the sun not settling if the track had crazy elevation, gliding, anti-gravity, harder, or something to compensate, but they gave us nothing, and removed an entire extra section of the track that was in the original with ground shy guys that grab you by the cart and stick to it for a short time. There's no reason to play this track. The music is great, yes, so what? The Mario Kart 8 soundtrack is phenomenal, just go listen to it on YouTube if you care so much. Plus Sky Garden is still at least fun to play on, it is just extremely short. This track is straight up boring to race on and feels soulless to look at. This is by far the worst retro remake in Mario Kart history, up there with the DS version of GC and Mushroom Bridge where you cannot drive on the bridge. The only part I disagree with here is being able to forgive the sun not setting. That's the entire identity of the track right there, and now it's just gone for no reason. And from one disappointing desert to another, we start off our GCN selection with Dry Desert. When I first played Double Dash a few months ago, I was actually caught off guard by how not atrocious the original version of this track was. It wasn't one of the game's strongest tracks by any means, but I didn't hate driving on it and even found a few elements of the track fun, especially the charm factor it had. Yeah, all of that's gone now. The Sarlacc Piranha plant, while not much of a major factor gameplay-wise, added a lot of flavor to the sandpit section, but now it's just a bit of a wide open area that you have to go through. There's a tornado that went backwards along the track that was a great hazard, but now it's just gone, with no replacement to keep things interesting. And the Oasis section. Oh boy, the Oasis section. While I'll concede that it's certainly the strong visual set piece of the remake, it's nowhere near as strong as the now-deceased Sarlacc Piranha plant, and it paid for that in the gameplay. It used to be a larger section of the track with lots of item boxes at the top of raised off-road hills and even more pokies to dodge, and it was fun trying to get through that section without getting hit. But now, you just drive forward through the water and try not to think about the fact that there's water in a track called Dry Desert. No, Paper Mario fans, I don't care that it's maybe a reference even though it probably wasn't intentional. It was stupid in that game and it's stupid here. Adding even more insult to injury, while the track has high quality visuals, it also looks so bland and boring that combined with everything else wrong with this track, I believe that it held the title of the worst track in the entire game up until Sunset Wilds dropped. I like to theorize that this track was originally intended to be in Mario Kart 7's Mushroom Cut, but then they cut it and saved it for this game because they realized they forgot to put in a track from Super Circuit. It doesn't really affect the track's ranking, which is D tier in case you couldn't tell, but I just thought I'd mention it because I think it's a funny theory. Alright, now that we're done with that, we can move on to the other base game GCN track that was disappointing in Double Dash, and that track would be Sherbet Land. Seriously, who decided that this lineup was okay? That's 2 of the bottom 3 from that game right there, and they were the only Double Dash tracks when this game first dropped. Tangent aside, unlike its fellow GCN track, Sherbet Land actually got some nice improvements when compared to its original version. They added some nice alternate routes hidden in the bodies of water throughout the track, which is a great decision that I think can and should be applied to more ice tracks, like, say, Vanilla Lake. The freezies are also less annoying because they no longer freeze you in place for 3 seconds, which, while less fitting for them, does ultimately make dealing with them better. The visuals are also absolutely stunning, with the ice tunnel and the fireworks in the background being notably pleasant on the eyes. But perhaps the best change this track got was not being a slippery ice track in Double Dash, the slipperiest Mario Kart game, and therefore being actually functional to drive on. While it does have some great changes to it, much like Snowland, it is still pretty much just another ice track in spite of them, so I think it joins that track in B tier. Next up on the list is Yoshi Circuit, returning to the series after its debut at the end of the DS video. Fortunately for this track, it is no longer the final track of the game, nor the 5th circuit track out of 16 total retro tracks, nor stuck with the DS's hardware limitations, allowing it to do a lot more in comparison. Of course I can't talk about this track without talking about how its layout is in the shape of a Yoshi, but more than just being a silly gag, it actually makes for a fantastic layout that's always fun to drive on and take long drifts through. The track also looks fantastic as well, with some nice visual changes such as the town at the beginning of the track making for great additions, and the spine section has opened up quite a bit to allow for some nice shortcuts. While this track isn't a perfect remake, the tunnel shortcut and Yoshicopter are still missing, there's still a ton going for this version of the track, and I think it deserves the title of second best circuit in the entire franchise behind my beloved Royal Raceway, and a spot in A tier to boot. And the anonymous source for this track agrees, saying, "Not gonna lie, it'll always be a classic." I couldn't have said it better myself. And now for our second GCN track, referring. Interesting. They're putting the plants back. And now for our second GCN track returning from the DS seeking its former glory in a row, we have Baby Park, the most controversial track in all of Mario Kart. While I absolutely slammed the DS version of this track, and for good reason, this version of the track finally returns the greatness that had been missing for 10 years prior to its return. The track is back to 7 laps, it's emphasized perfect for item build-up to occur and be a serious threat, and the background is as chaotic as it ever was on the GameCube. They even added some little shortcuts in the U-turns to make items like the mushroom feel just a little bit better to have. And they made the item boxes move backwards along the track to make reload time faster. While some people complain that lacking the character-specific items like the giant banana, Bowser shell, chain chomp, and egg make this version of the track significantly worse than the original, I'd argue that having other powerful items like the Super Horn, Piranha Plant, Bullet Bill, and Boomerang Flower, in addition to everyone getting access to items like the Triple Shells, Bob Bomb, and Fireball based item, and the fact that there's now 12 races on the track instead of 8 make this version at least close to on par with the original. And I'd even argue that for me, this version of the track has become the definitive edition of everyone's favorite little Chaos Circle. It's an easy S tier for me. I live for the chaos. Re-entering the BCP, we have Waluigi Stadium, my personal favorite track from Double Dash, and a track that is still held up in this game. The layout is still great, but my new favorite addition this game has to offer is some alternate routes at the end of some half-pipes that you have to trick to reach. It's not the most insane addition ever, especially after its Wii iteration gave us the half-pipes in the first place, but it's a very well-fitting addition and really only proves to me that Waluigi Stadium is consistently the best retro track. The track also looks really good, which is crazy considering what the BCB has offered for some tracks. While some look worse than they did on the DS, this one looks like it fit right in with the base game, which is certainly an accomplishment. My only minor complaint is that they changed the formation of the mechanical piranha plants for no reason, but it's such a small grievance that I don't think is worth devoting too much time to, even if it was random and unnecessary. This track remains an S tier once again. It's the GOAT for a reason after all. Next up we have a track returning from Mario Kart 7 with not much change to talk about, that being Daisy Cruiser. It's essentially the same as it was in that game, but the colors look a bit nicer and there's a few more places to trick off of. I don't really know what else to talk about. It's still a bit worse than the original gameplay wise in my opinion. I still miss the life preservers. The brig being filled with water still makes no sense. I would have liked to see Peach Beach with more done to make it better instead if I'm being honest, but this one's still good. A solid A tier. Moving on. And for our last entry for the GCN tracks, we have DK Mountain, which I consider to be a bit disappointing considering its legacy if I'm being honest. This track is like the opposite of Waluigi Stadium, where that track got better from GameCube to Wii to Switch. This track only got worse, and it's mostly because of the engines of the games the track is in. While the controls get better and better, the dangerous feel of the track gets lower and lower, which is the main appeal of the track as a whole. Weird, I know, but it makes sense when you play the track. They also nerf the hazards a lot. They rarely feel like threats at all, and it feels so counter to what the original versions of the track were going for. Pretty much everything else about the track is good, everything looks nice, especially the mountain's face, and I appreciate the DK barrels in the off-road. The gameplay's taken quite a bit of a hit, and its tier placement reflects that fact. It's a solid B tier. Still good, but not that close to its original glory. And now we've reached the DS tracks and the halfway point with Cheap Cheap Beach. Yippee! Anyways, Cheap Cheap Beach is about as basic as beach tracks get. There's just nothing super memorable about this one to help it stand out. There's no super unique hazards, no super interesting locales, nothing. You go on a pier and through a little jungle section, but they're both short sections at the very beginning and very end of the track, respectively, and there's nothing actually interesting going on in those sections. You can go through the water now, which is a great and obvious addition, but it feels like this track really doesn't do too much with it in the same way Koopa Troopa Beach did. They also added a pointless glider at the beginning too, just to make the remake feel worth it. You avoid some sidesteppers and cheap cheeps around the middle part of the track. And also the track looks really nice, but so does just about every base game track. It feels like this track is just going through the motions, both as a beach track and as a retro track. So I'll give it a C tier ranking. Maybe my standards for beach tracks are just too high, I don't know. Next up on the kinda forgettable DS tracks list, we have Wario Stadium. I've always been more of a Waluigi guy myself, but this one isn't bad by any means. It hits the theme it's going for well, a high-octane motocross arena with lots of potential for cool stunts. The track also manages to use essentially every new mechanic introduced since its debut. While the underwater section and glider ramp feel a bit forced in my opinion, the anti-gravity section is a nice fit, and of course the tricking feels right at home on this track. However, the track itself is a bit bland visually, and I'm not the biggest fan of the daytime setting of the track. I think the original nighttime was just a bit better, but it's not a big deal, and either way, both pale in comparison to Sunset. I think this track is a nice B tier. Nothing too crazy, but it does what it wants, and it does it well. But now we break the streak with one of the best tracks from the DS, that being Tick Tock Clock, and somehow, they've managed to take this amazing track and make it even better. Both the clock hands and pendulums have been reimagined as hazards in interesting ways. The clock hands can now be tricked off of it or even driven over for a potential shortcut, and the pendulums are now walls instead of damaging hazards, which have the potential to be dangerous in an entirely different way. The gears section now has a glider installed before it so that you can glide over them, or you can drive along them and get some tricks off of the teeth of the gears. But the best update this track got was to its visuals. Not only are they some of the highest quality the game has to offer, but a ton has been added to make the track feel much busier overall, just like how one would expect the inside of a clock to look, making this the final podium position for best visual glow up in the franchise alongside the SNES and N64 versions of Rainbow Road. The track was already S tier before, and it certainly still is now. What a showing this track has had in this game. And our anonymous source certainly seemed to think so, as they left a very thorough review going into details about the specifics of this track. I'm not going to be reading all of this aloud to save my voice, but for their main comment they said, Mario Kart DS got the weakest retro track representation relatively to its potential in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, but we still got some hidden gems like Tick Tock Clock. This track tends to be very underlooked by the majority of the player base due to its tech-heavy gameplay, but I think most experienced players will agree with saying that the better you get at this track, the more you like it. This track was already very interesting in DS, but it even got a solid glow up to adapt it to this game. The amount of tricky yet satisfying techs you can do on the clock hands and on the gears really make this track stand out as one of the best technical tracks in the game. Doing the techs to stay on good pace is also rewarding, because if you're in a slow pace, you will get blocked by the clock cycles. The gimmicks and obstacles on this track just work really well without feeling unfair. This track also got to glow up aesthetically. It looks clean and pleasing to look at. The theming is good and the music is surprisingly catchy for being real-life instruments mixed to synth and clock sounds. I don't think I have too much to add here, they nailed it right on the head with this one. Our next entry is DS Shroom Ridge, which is a track that I have surprisingly mixed feelings about. On the one hand, it's got some cool stuff, like some great added shortcuts using a glider ramp and a giant fan, and the music is absolutely banging, which you know must be high praise considering I don't think I've discussed this music a single time in this video yet. However, I have two issues with this track, and they unfortunately have to do with some of the most important parts of the track, the visuals and the gameplay. I've talked about bad BCP graphics a decent amount already, and while this isn't the worst offender I've talked about so far, nor is it the final track to have this issue, it is still an issue for me nonetheless. I know some people prefer how this track looks, but I'm not a fan of the plasticky look of the visuals on this track. And in addition, the original version of this track had two-way traffic, which for some reason got changed to one-way traffic in this version, and I'm not a big fan of how the driving changed because of that. It's still fine, and with the shortcuts I'd consider it about equal to its original incarnation, winning itself a solid B tier placement. The next up is the second part in tracks that were ported to the BCP from Mario Kart 7 with essentially no changes, thanks to Waluigi Pinball. You can honestly just watch this track segment in part 3 of the series, and it'd be the same stuff I would talk about here, except I'd give more praise to the codes because they really pop in this version, even more than before. Other than that, everything else about this track is essentially exactly the same, and hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? There are actually two things I want to talk about for a bit that are just pet peeves of mine that don't really affect the ranking of the track too much, and they're both related to auditory elements of the track. The first is the gutter ball sound effect that plays in the opening overview of the track, but not near the end of the track like it did in the original. I don't really understand why they didn't just have it played there, but maybe it had something to do with online or split-screen multiplayer. It's likely because the earlier part of the BCP was probably rushed, and all of the effort to give a track its iconic Easter eggs went into one track specifically that I'm sure about 50% of the people watching immediately thought of just now, but I digress. The other thing I want to talk about is the music, because this track is the only track that shares music with another track in the entire game, alongside Wario Stadium, but I didn't talk about it there because that track got there first. I understand why they didn't remake the entire song for this track, especially because, like I previously said, it's very likely that the early part of the BCP was rushed, but I can't help but feel a bit disappointed that there's only 95 track themes in the game when there's 96 tracks, especially after the music team made a conscious decision to make the music for the starter track and the music from Mario Circuit distinct from each other for the first time ever. But regardless, it doesn't actually mean much. The track is still incredible, and it's an easy S tier from me. It must be fantastic if it got referenced in Super Mario Party Jamboree, right? Our next DS track is Peach Gardens, which I'm sure you could already guess is one of my favorites. However, this track takes its remake to the next level with how much of a visual overhaul it got. Some hedges have been reshaped to look like Luigi and Peach, the not actually a peace sign has been transformed into the home of a giant piranha plant ahead of the modernized moving Bronte moles. Why did I write that? Some hedges have been reshaped to look like Luigi and Peach, the not actually a peace sign has been transformed into the home of a giant piranha plant ahead of the modernized moving Monty moles, and in general there's less patches of grass to avoid, making the whole track look cleaner. All of this would be great on its own, but then the third lap has you go on a completely different route similar to what Calamari Desert did, and now you're going backwards on the track and gliding over the main chain jump section. You can even high-five the Luigi head because of that, which is pretty cool. The track is a good bit easier now, which does suck a bit. It is the only negative thing compared to all of the praises I just sang about this track, and I don't mind it too much. It's another S tier track for me. Oh, and while I'm talking about this track, I'd like to go ahead and make my only retroactive changes for this entire series for part 2 of the series. I'm bumping that game's version of Peach Gardens up to S tier. It does everything fantastically, what can I say? And I'm bumping N64 Bowser's Castle down to A tier. It's still great, but the overall layout and gameplay is still pretty simple despite its difficulty, which made me lower it just a bit. But yeah, all of my other opinions are still up to date at this point in time, and I don't think I'll be changing them anytime soon. Getting back to Peach Gardens, we have an anonymous review for this track that says, "Just a track with a very pretty atmosphere, good music, and this is just a track that makes me smile. It's also Peach themed, which is nice to see and gets bonus points." This person knows what's up. But now, to finish off the DS section, we have quite the interesting selection with Mario Circuit. No, I'm not factoring in the fact that this could have been another DS track, like, say, Airship Fortress for this track's ranking. That's not fair to it. However, I still have my criticisms, the main one being that it's still just a kind of boring circuit at the end of the day. It does have some stuff going for it to help it stand out. The fire-breathing piranha plants are a unique hazard that can be challenging to avoid. The visually overhauled wood section is a great change of pace that even adds a wiggler on the third lap and some shortcuts, and the layout overall is pretty difficult but still fun to drive on, thanks to its original placement in Mario Kart DS's Star Cup. But all of that is only helping to support another Mario circuit, and I think it places itself in the B tier. Good, but nothing spectacular. And now we finally reached the Wii tracks. And our first one, funnily enough, is the first retro track in all of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, that being Moo Moo Meadows. Befitting its opening track status, this is a very simple track with not too much crazy stuff going on, although the titular Moo Moos and the updated Monty Moles are nice hazards to have to make the track not seem so boring. They added a random, mostly useless glider ramp near the end as well, just in case you feel like flying for a bit. However, the thing this track really has going for it is the visuals, because my goodness, this track is beautiful. The sunrise glow the background has, coupled with the high quality dirt and grass of the road and off-road, make this track a sight to behold, and overall make the track feel very cozy. However, the gameplay is still what matters most, and because of that, I think this track deserves a solid B tier placement. Our anonymous source, however, is back with another lengthy review, and they appear to disagree with my analysis given their main argument. This is undoubtedly the worst Wii track in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. It was already bad in Mario Kart Wii, probably the only bad Nitro track in that game, but Mario Kart 8 Deluxe made it even worse, at least gameplay-wise. This track is very short and there are only 2 item sets per lap, making the gameplay very RNG due to lack of item pulls to play in the race and make a comeback, or just survive the draft at the beginning of the race. Talking about drafts, Moo Moo Meadows is very powerful drafter and shroomer due to the simplicity of the first turn, followed by the only relevant shortcut it has to offer. The cows can catch some new players off guard, but they aren't really that much of a threat. The glider path is useless. You lose a lot of time just to reach one of the worst coin spots in the entire game. Most players don't even know about the coins on the windmill. Also, shocks rarely happen on this track, so taking that path to predict a shock is also not worth it. I really don't know what Nintendo was smoking when making the original Mario Kart 8 to add this track over Toad's Factory, but at least the theming is pretty good and the music is catchy. I'd like to address the bad Nitro track allegations, because not only is Moo Moo Meadows not that bad, both Luigi and Mario Circuit from Mario Kart Wii are worse by pretty significant margins. But otherwise, yeah, there's some pretty good takes in here, but I just don't mind them that much if I'm being honest. I just like driving on the cow track. And now for the only other Wii track featured in the base game for Mario Kart 8 on the Wii U, we have Grumble Volcano. Seriously, the fact that we got 4 and 64 tracks for the original retro selection is absurd, and I'd twist things around and get one of those 4, probably Toad's Turnpike, swapped out for Toad's Factory in a heartbeat. Tangent aside, this course is pretty cool, ironically enough. The volcano setting sets a very dangerous and ominous tone for the track, which is elevated even further by parts of the track falling away over time, which is a really cool mechanic that fits perfectly with the theme of the track. Much like Moo Moo Meadows, some glider ramps have been added, but they're not super out of the way and can be beneficial, so I'm more positive about their inclusion. And finally, the visual glow up this track got is equally as impressive as Moo Moo Meadows, with the track looking a lot more threatening than it ever did on the Wii. I think this track deserves an A-tier placement. It's not among the absolute best Mario Kart Wii has to offer, but it's certainly very good regardless. It's almost noon, and I'm only on Wario's Gold Mine? I'm so behind. How long is this thing gonna be? Probably not as long as I think it is. And now for our final base Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Wii track, we have Wario's Gold Mine. Much like the previous 2 tracks, the visual glow up this track got is insane, with the sunrise in the background looking incredible and the roads in the cave being equally impressive to look at. The main thing this remake got is anti-gravity in the cave section, and it really shakes things up. The section before the jump has turns now instead of a simple down and up, and the minecarts now get spin boosts instead of acting as hazards. I personally think the hazardous version is better, but it's not by too much, and I still enjoy how this version of the track plays. They also removed the half pipes along parts of the track because they didn't feel like adding them in yet, but they're not the most important thing to miss, and in their place we got some ramps on a few turns to take some little shortcuts, and I think they're pretty neat. Overall, this is another track that I think places at the same tier as its original version despite being notably different, and that means this track gets an A-tier placement. We have another anonymous review for this track. Be ready, the Wii and 3DS tracks had a lot of them. This person says, whenever people talk about Wii tracks that were watered down from the original, the ones that are usually brought up are Coconut Mall and Koopa Cape. For me, however, Wario's Gold Mine also got it kinda rough. Not only are the minecarts anti-gravity, which takes away from the thrill of avoiding them in the original Wii version, but the track in general doesn't feel the same. This is one of those rare instances where the addition of anti-gravity actually makes the track worse, because part of what made me love the original was the challenge of avoiding the minecarts, and how satisfying it feels whenever you manage to not hit any of them. It's not the most neutered retro track in 8 Deluxe, and I'd argue that it's the most neutered Wii track, even more than the others that are more commonly brought up. I don't agree with all of these points, but the argument is sound, and I ultimately agree with the general point. Not the worst though, we'll get to there later. And now we return once again to the BCP with Wii Coconut Mall. The track had a bit of a fall from its glorious original version in the last retro review video, and here it's about the same. A lot of people have complained about this track's visuals as a whole, and while I won't defend the quality of these textures, as we've seen numerous times before, being in Wave 1 of the BCP tends to do that, I will absolutely say that the stylistic choices are great, almost on par with the original. The oranges really pop in that standout way you'd expect a shopping mall to go for, and I can't see anyone being mad about the Super Mario Bros. Decorations on some of the turns in this track. This version certainly does better in this department than Mario Kart 7's version did, what with how empty and lifeless that track felt. However, one area where the other 2 versions outshine this version is in the gameplay, and by that I mean just the parking lot section. We're still missing the third car from the Wii version, but now they don't even move back and forth anymore, just occasionally spinning outwards from two set positions, and the boost pads are missing as well. There's been some other alterations to gameplay, but much like in the 7 version, they don't actually affect that much and aren't worth mentioning. Overall, I still think this is a weaker version of the track compared to the original, but I'd say that it's arguably slightly better than it was in 7, and still deserving of an A-tier placement. We have another anonymous review for this track, and this person says, "You just got coconut mauled." Yes, this joke is old, but who cares? Fair enough. Next up, we have Mushroom Gorge, and I'm gonna say it, this is my favorite version of this track. I think it takes the best parts of each of the first two versions of the track and puts them together to make something even better. Right from the beginning of the track, the old shortcut is back after its disappearance from Mario Kart 7, and while I talked about how little it actually mattered to me in the previous video, I'm not going to complain about having more cool shortcuts to take. My favorite part of this new version of the track, however, has to be the cave section. Instead of having two routes with varying red and green mushrooms, or having one route like that and with another route ending in a blue glider mushroom, they decided to do both and give people even more options to go about the cave, which is always cool. Speaking of the cave section, it's really nice looking, especially with the crystals illuminating everything in bright blue and purple light. However, the rest of the track is a bit lacking in the visual department quality-wise, unfortunately. And yet again, much like in Mario Kart 7, the best thing about this track is that it's actually functional, unlike how it was on the Wii. I think it gets another solid A-tier placement from me. Our third anonymous reviewer in a row says about this track, "The mushrooms present a good challenge, and there are diverse paths you can take to switch up the gameplay. The shortcut opportunities are crazy with the gap cut and the mushrooms at the beginning that I love. The music is also pretty good with a nice feel." Yeah, I agree with all of this. Nice review, random internet person. We complete our trilogy of great tracks that were ported from Mario Kart 7 with essentially no changes whatsoever. We have Maple Treeway. Much like Daisy Cruiser and Waluigi Pinball, I don't have too much to say about this still incredible track. It still looks very good, especially with the BCP stylistic choices. The colors really stand out here. The Wigglers had their movement changed up a bit, but it's not super noticeable and there's still good hazards to dodge. They reintroduced the half pipe and that's pretty cool too. Yeah, it's still an amazing track that's just a great time to drive on and look at, and I think it's an S-tier track. And our anonymous source for this track agrees, saying, "This track is simply beautiful with the autumn aesthetic. I love going on the trees and the branches, which can be pretty easy to fall off if you're not careful. The music being calm makes for a track that is relaxing." Again, great stuff. Next up is the iconic DK Summit, the first Wii track in the BCP to not be in Mario Kart 7 as well. The half-pipes are still here like in the previous track, but I want to talk about them more because I barely mentioned them in that track and they're the defining feature of this track. These half-pipes have a reputation of being dangerously silly, quite similar to how they were in Wii, but with even more potential for stupid stuff to happen. You've probably seen a clip of someone going off a half-pipe near the end of the track and flying off into the sun before returning to the ground on the opposite side of the track, going the wrong way. And yet, the fact that they can do that is pretty stupid, but it seems to me at least to be hard to get and easy to avoid. More often than not, the reputation is unearned and they function mostly as intended. And for more about the actual track itself, it's still a great time. Putting the cannon up to the top of the track is never not satisfying, nor is taking the shortcut at the windy section, even though I've yet to successfully pull off a fast version of the shortcut of any kind. Lower emphasis on the coolness of trekking in this game compared to Mario Kart Wii does hurt a bit, but I don't think it's that much of a detriment to the track, and I think that this track remains in A tier. Our anonymous source, however, begs to differ, saying, "I didn't like this track all that much in Wii, putting it in the C tier. So when I heard it was coming to this game, I was hyped because they could finally make me like this track. And it is much worse. From the cannon to the bumps, no complaints. In fact, this is better than Wii. But the second half is unenjoyable. The single cut is obsolete now because of how easy the double is, plus the respawn times there are ridiculous. Like, you go so far down. Then the Shy Guy section is annoying as well because of how the half pipes can screw you over if you have a slightly bad angle. I never have fun on this track. 92 out of 96 favorite track, F tier. Most of the stuff I understand, but the single cut being obsolete is one of the weirdest arguments I've ever heard. Like, who cares if a shortcut isn't that good because another shortcut is better? I really don't think that should affect an opinion on the track very much at all, even if I understand, and disagree with, everything else. But next up, we have another first-time retro track thanks to Moonview Highway. This is a pretty controversial track in both of its appearances, but I think this track was good but nothing too special on the Wii, and it's much of the same here. I do think I slightly prefer that Wii version because of the major nerf the traffic got in this game. I'm okay with the number of cars being toned down, and with the cars not moving super fast anymore in the straightaway section, as the city section is called according to Nintendo Music, but the fact that the cars don't change lanes when they are able to anymore except at the beginning and end of the straightaway section really hurts this track. I would have liked to see that come back in some way, shape, or form. The only other major change this track got from a gameplay standpoint is that the boost pads in the straightaway section are now randomized every race, except on time trials. But that really isn't doing much of anything aside from being a fun little addition, I guess. As for everything else about this track, it's a definite improvement over the original. The visuals are fantastic. Nintendo does a really good job with nighttime settings, and in particular I love the city section's vibrant colors. Of course I have to mention the Mushroom Moon poster, which looks so good when it features my beloved Peach and the incredible 2D art style Nintendo sporadically uses for Mario stuff. And of course, I have to take another opportunity on our traffic course to talk about the massive glow up it got in the music department, because this version of the track is absolutely fantastic. And I'm definitely not talking about the music because I'm running out of things to say about traffic courses, which I think are just kind of whatever overall. I think this track is a solid B tier, just like it was on the Wii. Good, but nothing too special. But now we have the return of Koopa Cape, which was already weakened after its appearance in Mario Kart 7, and is now somehow even worse. I don't know how they managed to do that, but they did. Let's start from the least bad of the bad stuff, the visuals. I just complimented the BCP for its visuals for Moonview Highway, but then in the same way, they gave us this disgusting looking track. Those brown rocks throughout the track just are not it, Chief, and the rest of the track isn't faring much better in the visual department. As for the gameplay, the most important part, it's also not great. The underwater section still sucks because they still haven't added the ceiling back in, but now there's even more wrong with it. I lamented the lack of lightning spinners back in the Mario Kart 7 video and said that the Cheep Cheeps were far worse as hazards, so you know what Nintendo did to fix that problem? They removed all the hazards, meaning that there's no significant threat to worry about when driving through that section. They made an anti-gravity and added a half-pipe for some reason, and while they aren't terrible additions on their own, it doesn't fix the lack of hazards here, and thanks to the section of the track becoming shorter in comparison as well, the entire standout part of the track in the original version just flies by without any chance to take it in. And to make matters even worse, they also shortened the current section right before it, which was the other fun part of the track. It astounds me how much of this track Nintendo absolutely butchered, because they just don't seem to understand what made this track appealing in the first place. I didn't even like this track as much as most people, and I'm still wondering how and why this could happen. There's still some fun to be had, so it only gets C tier instead of D tier, but this is easily the weakest Wii retro track for me. And our anonymous source for this track shares a similar opinion, saying, Koopa Cape Wii is my favorite track of all time. This is a corpse wearing Koopa Cape's skin. The mountain is the generic brown BCP slop color. So many little details just completely revoked. They had the chance to do something really cool anti-grav with the tunnel section. Instead, they copy-pasted the exact same thing from the previous game. The most disappointing track in the entire DLC for me. Honestly, I don't even have much more to say here. Let's just take a moment of silence for the original Koopa Cape. Anyways, we move on to another track from Wii Star Cup, which is somehow represented in its entirety in Mario Kart Deluxe with Daisy Circuit. It's a nice little track in both of its appearances, and I like driving on it. They didn't do too much to the actual gameplay of the track, aside from adding a glider ramp at the end of this track's major shortcut, a random ramp out to the tunnel, and some boost pads on the big turn near the end of the track. But there really is only so much you can do to a circuit track, and this track really didn't need too much anyways. But this track really shines as the presentation. First of all, it's shaped like a gun, and that's funny without being too out of character for Daisy. I feel like she would do that. Secondly, there's the music, which is absolutely fantastic thanks to the live instruments and the additions of a flute and some strings to really round out the sound. And last but most certainly not least, there's the visuals. Wii fortunately stuck the landing for the most part when it came to the visuals, and Daisy Circuit is no exception. Everything is orange, including the skybox, which is a lovely sunset glow to it and it looks great. The town section looks nice, the water looks amazing, and the copper statue is a great stylistic choice compared to the original. Just ignore the fact that Daisy has the eyes of a rock and roller. Overall, I think this track is a solid B tier, a track that I don't think is too spectacular, but still a good time to drive on overall. Our anonymous reviewer for this track begs to differ, saying, "Why this one? This track choice makes no sense. I get wanting to appeal to the Wii crowd, except DK Mountain was in this wave as well, a much more popular track also in Wii. Why have it in the last wave over any DS pick? But what about the track itself? It loses all the charm the original had. The pastel colors of the Wii original combined with the peppy over-the-top music made it one of the best circuits. Now the Mario Kart game with over-the-top music gave it a very subtle theme which in no way stands up to the original, and also becomes more generic road like most of the tour track. Honestly, I don't agree with any of these points, but I've already talked about them for a while and I'm just tired at this point. I'm moving on. And now, because I'm definitely not skipping a track in order to save it for the end for no particular reason, we have ourselves a 3DS tracks, and first up is DK Jungle. I used to have a very high regard for this track, but as I've played it more, it's gotten more and more boring for me. Maybe playing more of Donkey Kong Country Returns helped me realize this, which, by the way, it's a really good game even if I've only gotten a little over halfway so far, but this track really doesn't do much to actually represent the game it's based off of. It's not devoid of references, but everything feels very bare bones, especially the decision to leave the track only in the jungle. Donkey Kong Country Returns is 8 different worlds with differing themes, but this track went with the boring theme of the first world because, oh, monkey live in jungle. What doesn't help is that the actual gameplay of this track is pretty simple. There's only like 2 places where there's split routes on this track, and the few hazards that are on the track do not pose a very significant threat. I legitimately don't remember why I liked this track so much before. It's just very boring and not super fun to drive on. I think this track gets a C tier placement. Our anonymous source for this one shares a similar viewpoint of mine, saying, 3DS DK Jungle seems to be a divisive track among the community. Is that the love for being an homage to Donkey Kong Country Returns, or disappointed because it doesn't go far enough with the theme? For me, I like the track well enough for what it is, but at the same time, I will admit it could have been more. Imagine a track based off of one of the Donkey Kong Country Returns worlds that wasn't jungle themed, or even a track that highlights every world, much like Yoshi's Island, but Donkey Kong Country themed. Honestly, I agree with that last part, even if this track first debuted in 2012 was one of the first big crossover tracks in Mario Kart and they hadn't really figured everything out yet. But still, it's disappointing. But next up is the highlight of Mario Kart 7 for me, and that is Music Park. I guess it would make sense seeing as I'm a big music guy, but there's more to the track than just the concept. The use of musical instruments throughout the track, especially as parts of the track the driver bounce over, such as the piano, xylophone, glockenspiel, and tambourines, is top-notch. And the hazards also relating to the music, such as the head-bopping piranha plants and the giant music notes that bounce in time with the music, only add to the great theming this track has. The track also looks fantastic as well, with the bright colors contrasting nicely with the darkness of the sky and road. There's also, of course, the music itself, which is incredibly fun and bouncy, making timing things such as when to trick after the music notes land easy and streamlined. I do wish that there were more real instruments and less synths used, but it's a minor complaint, and it doesn't really affect my opinion of the track much. The same goes for the fact that there was literally nothing new added to this track. Like I said for Waluigi Pinball, don't mess with perfection. This track is an easy S tier for me, and it'll always be one of my favorites. Following that up, we have another very strong track from its original game, that being Piranha Plant Slide. I can't believe that this was the first track to really pull heavy inspiration from the original Super Mario Bros. Game, but now that it's here I really appreciate it and it does the job wonderfully. It has great gameplay thanks to the rushing water in the first half of the track, and even a light platforming section near the middle and end of the track. But the biggest star of the show in this remake has to be the big underwater section near the end of the track, which has been revamped visually with added anti-gravity and makes the original version of the track pale in comparison. While the 3DS had a cramped, closed-in section with little room to see where to go and what options to take, the Wii U and Switch have a section angled 45 degrees downward from the beginning that's been heavily opened up and filled with background details that don't take away from the main driving of the track, while also allowing you to better see what options to take to avoid the piranha plant near the end of the track. As a whole, I think these changes made this section the standout portion of the track that it was trying to be, and gave it the je ne sais quoi that the section was missing in the original, as amazing as that version was. Add on the HD visuals powering up the track even more, and we have an open and shut case for S tier. Next up from the 3DS we have Neo Bowser City, a track that has always been controversial for some reason. I really don't understand how this track became the loved or hated track for Mario Kart 7, but I digress. It's a pretty simple track all things considered, but I like it. The impressively rainy atmosphere of the city is great for setting the mood of the track, which complements the slippery road quite nicely, and is made even better in this game thanks to some more glorious HD visuals. There hasn't been too much done to the track gameplay-wise, with the only addition being a small anti-gravity section near the very end of the track, but it works well enough and I don't mind it too much. Overall, this is just a pretty good course, and I think it deserves a solid B tier. Our anonymous source for this track says, easily one of the Mario Kart tracks of all time, and the high difficulty this track brings with the rain making your drift slippery, and the S-turn near the end of the track is satisfying to pull off every time, especially on 200cc. And the music on this track as well, it makes you really feel like you're in a busy futuristic city at night. I don't think they meant to call this track one of the tracks of all time, but I kinda agree with that, which is pretty funny honestly. And returning to the BCP, we have the track that everyone points to as the definitive example of the lack of quality in the early part of the DLC, and that track is the infamous Toad Circuit. I defended this track's right to be in the game in a previous video, but there's one thing I won't defend, and that's this track's quality. It's a starter circuit track, and it certainly feels like it, with gentle easy turns on very wide roads. The layout itself is barely more than a figure 8, and there's nothing to actually do or avoid with the exception of a single glider ramp after the first turn. And then there's the visuals. Oh my, the visuals. I've talked about the Wave 1 visuals curse, and perhaps no track better exemplifies this than Toad Circuit. Even after this track got improvements in the visuals department, it's still one of the worst looking tracks in the entire game, with the grassy off-road being a single piece of an ugly bright green, the sandy off-road being a single piece of an ugly yellow, and everything in general just not being very polished. I don't think anyone will be surprised when I put this track in D tier. It's one of the most universally agreed upon placements ever. An anonymous source says about this track, overhated but not good. It's bizarre how this is worse visually than the 3DS rendition, but generally inoffensive aside from that, a fairly nothing track overall. I don't disagree with the points here, but I'd argue that the nothing gameplay combined with the worst visuals is plenty enough to make it a bad track. I don't know why anyone would ever want to play on this track. And now we have Rock Mountain. I think I should start with a brief preface here. I'm not the biggest fan of this track in its original version. I've always found nature tracks to be not super interesting compared to the cartoonish fantasy of other tracks like, say, Music Park, the track that came before this one in Mario Kart 7. And while I'll admit gliding is pretty fun, not only is it all the track really has in my opinion, I don't think it even uses it in a way that I find fun. My favorite part of gliding is going over a massive gap with the fear of falling and losing a ton of time while Lakitu picks me up, and most of the gliding on this track is road beneath it, completely losing that feeling of danger. But putting those biases aside and looking at the track objectively, I have to ask, what does this version of the track have anymore? If you like the visuals of the original version, then enjoy looking at the Play-Doh replica the BCP's visuals gave us instead of the beautifully detailed ridges and trees that the 3DS had. If you enjoyed the intricate and mechanically deep gliding of the main section of the track, then enjoy its clunkier and less precise gliding in its place. Everything that there was to enjoy about this track has been stripped away, leaving behind a plasticky husk that doesn't feel good to drive on. It's legitimately sad to see how far this track has fallen, even as someone that didn't like the track that much originally. In my opinion, this is one of the weakest tracks in the entire game, and definitely a D tier track. On the other hand, our anonymous sources about this track, my favorite track in the entire series. While falling down a whole tier due to Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's glider mechanics being worse than 7's, and no longer my favorite in this game, it still remains the very top of S tier, not S+. The music is on par with the original, though I would say very slightly worse. Something about the electric guitar feels wrong, but I'm not bothered by it. The tour-like graphics have never bothered me at all in the BCP, and it is most evident here. A fun time every time, just overshadowed by the god that is the original. Here, this one's for all the Rock Mountain fans out there. I'm just gonna continue onwards. And now, because I'm definitely not going out of order again or to have an exciting ending, we have Rosalina's Ice World, the Surprise Wave 6 edition that not many people were expecting due to the existence of Piranha Plant Pipeline. And I'm not gonna lie, I wish we had gotten Piranha Plant Pipeline instead of this track because it's just pretty disappointing. What's odd is that I like playing on the track in both Mario Kart 7 and Mario Kart Tour because I actually played that game a bit, but in this game it just doesn't feel right. The big turn at the beginning of the track is really cramped and frustrating to go through, especially on the first lap or just any time most of the pack is together. The half pipes make sense but have some weird moments, and the cave section with the icicles is a bit annoying to deal with. However, my biggest problem with this track has to be with the visuals. Despite being in Wave 6, a point in time in which the BCP had figured out most of the visual flaws that held it back in the earlier waves, this track really doesn't look that good, and this is most notable with the aforementioned cave section. The textures are incredibly simple, and there's just no variance from the overwhelming light blue everywhere, a far cry from the more unique and colored lighting from the 3DS version featuring multiple shades of blue and even some greenish colors in there. The rest of the track doesn't really do much better in that department either, which is only amplified by the track not really doing too much and actually being a Galaxy-themed track either. It's not one of the absolute worst things in the world, but it's a C-tier track in my opinion. I can sleep well at night without this track being in the game. Look, there's a reason that I went out of order just to save these two tracks for the end. Not only is it a better ending than finishing with Rosalina's Ice World, a mediocre ice track, but these two are probably the ones I have the most to say about them, and they're two of the most beloved tracks in the entire franchise. This is the kind of ending I think a video of this size, scale, and importance deserves, and I'd like to start with 3DS Rainbow Road, because man, this track is just so mid. Yeah, I think it's pretty mid, and I'm honestly surprised that it's so universally beloved instead of being more controversial. On the surface level, it just appears to be a lot like the other Rainbow Roads, but with more space stuff. I think space is cool. I should love this track, just like I love most of the other Rainbow Roads, but I find it to be pretty underwhelming in a lot of aspects. Despite having 3 unique segments forming a singular lap instead of the usual 3 laps, the layout isn't particularly fun or engaging, and I find the use of some of the space stuff to not be as cool as others do. Sure, Saturn and its rings are great, but that section of the track is essentially just a big turn, and the holes in the track and the boost pads aren't really fixing that fact. The moon section is a nice big open area, but I'm always left questioning why this is the only section of the track in low/anti-gravity when pretty much the rest of the track is in space, where there's virtually no gravity. And the asteroid field near the end of the track is neat, but I'm disappointed that these aren't actual hazards in the slightest, essentially just being cute little additions instead of genuine threats for the final section of the track. The biggest defense that I hear for this track is that it's just so stunning from a visual standpoint, but I don't really see it. Like, yeah, it's pretty, I'm not denying that, but so is every Rainbow Road. When the road is made of bright colors contrasting against a darkened sky, it's gonna look real nice no matter what. I would even argue that this isn't one of the best Rainbow Roads from a visual perspective either. We have the original N64 Rainbow Road with its segmented roads, starry walls, and background fireworks, the only appearance of GCN Rainbow Road with its shooting stars, hiding balloons, and vibrant cityscape below, and the 3 other Rainbow Roads I've either already talked about in this video, or will talk about in a moment. I wouldn't call not even making the top 5 one of the good ones, which is a bit disappointing for a track that seems to really put its all into its visuals, because that's the other reason I don't like this track. It's just not difficult. As the final track of the game, it has the responsibility to be the most difficult one of the lot, and it just is not very difficult. Heck, I'd argue that this track is easier than Shy Guy Falls, an actual Flower Cup track. You better believe that's an issue as far as I'm concerned. Every other Rainbow Road, bar a few exceptions, i.e. N64 Rainbow Road twice, does a good job at being a challenging track while still being a treat to the eyes and ears, because, oh yeah, I even find the music to be a bit disappointing too. The A section sounds nice, but it's just a bunch of long notes plodding along one after another, and it feels uninspired and boring. And then the B section is just N64 Rainbow Road again, and while it also sounds great because it's N64 Rainbow Road, it doesn't feel earned after that disappointing A section. GCN Rainbow Road also uses the N64 Rainbow Road theme, but that comes after a lively and energetic A section and a distinct and inspired B section. It earned that N64 Rainbow Road callback. And I haven't even compared this version of the track to the original, because heaven forbid I run out of things to complain about with this track. That bare bones layout I talked about before was actually nerfed in its transition to the BCP. Some of the more exaggerated verticality and angularity of this track has been removed, which is really odd when you remember that this is the game that allowed you to drive upside down for the first time in the series. Losing some of that impossible feeling driving in the game with anti-gravity in it is just embarrassing. And then there's the visuals. I know everyone likes to talk about the road itself, and while I think it's pretty with some cool effects, I don't think it's rainbowy enough for my Rainbow Road taste. There are even parts in the background where the road doesn't even look like a rainbow, and at that point the name of the track is just a lie. And also for some reason the lighting on this track is just not good sometimes. Most people point to the moon section, but I'd like to add that I've never liked the lighting on Saturn's rings either. And yet, in spite of all the negative stuff I've just said about this track, I still generally like it, and it's solid B tier. I just find it to not be anywhere near as great as most people say, and if this is your #1 favorite track in all of Mario Kart, raise your expectations or something, I don't know. Oh, and if you weren't expecting any of this and expected more positivity from me, welcome to the channel! You should like and subscribe. Anyways, we have an anonymous source for this track who says, no matter if it's 3DS or 8 Deluxe version, it'll always be the GOAT of Mario Kart tracks. Agree to disagree, I guess. I'm just tired of yapping about this track, to be honest. But moving on from all that, we have the other track that I saved for the end, and one that I find much more deserving of its place in the community, because while I don't think it's possible to actually achieve perfection, damn does Wii Rainbow Road get as close as I think is humanly possible. Call it Wii bias, call it Rainbow Road bias, I don't care, because this is the greatest track in all of Mario Kart. Everything about this track just works as well as it possibly could. The layout is so varied, with never a dull moment as notable moment by notable moment passes by. That rapid descent right out of the starting gate, that cannon that's now also a glider because that's how cannons work now, those split paths that have had their boost pads mirrored for some reason, that mandatory half-pipe jump that only mostly works, that wavy bridge with the starbase that thankfully did not get replaced by a glider, those hairpin turns that are still some of the most dangerous parts of the track to be on, and of course, that iconic open figure 8 section that made it destined for this game well before the BCP was announced. Every moment is fun from a gameplay perspective and stands out from the rest in its own way. And yet they all blend together into a fantastic overall layout that never gets old, not after 3 laps and not after 3,000. The entire track is now in anti-gravity, which makes the already dynamic feeling track make even more sense. Take notes, 3DS Rainbow Road. And it also comes with underwater physics that only increase the spacey feel of the track and allow for some cool opportunities for shortcuts and saves from death. It's not quite as brutal as it was due to that and this game's better controls, but it's still pretty difficult overall, and the lower difficulty allows for more opportunity to enjoy the track design and everything else about the track, such as the incredible visuals. Starting with the road itself, the tile pattern looks great with the bright pastel colors, which absolutely pop against the night sky. The various tunnels of light look stunning as well, with their vivid colors and streaks across the screen making for a beautiful visual effect whether in the canyon or on the final turn. The barriers with their star-top posts also look great, in addition to the background details such as various meteors and the star bits lining parts of the track. They even included the detail of characters burning up in the atmosphere after falling off, despite the change to how respawns work in this game with Lakitu, which is just absolutely incredible, and shows how much the people making this game care about this track. And of course, I feel like I need to talk about the music, because it is in my opinion the absolute best that this entire series has to offer. It's fast-paced, it's high energy, it's triumphant, it's memorable, it's beautiful, it's tear-jerking, it's synth-heavy, it's head-bop-worthy, it's even got a good Egg Galaxy reference in it. I honestly don't know what more you can want with it. I'm honestly running out of things to say about this track because it's just so indescribably majestic. Just go play it, honestly. The track speaks for itself better than I ever could. You'd better believe this track is an S tier. If I'd given myself the opportunity to, I'd put it above S tier without a moment's hesitation. And it seems many other people think so as well, considering that this was the most talked about track in any of the videos, with all of the reviews being overwhelmingly positive. Except for this one, but based on the reference to Mario Kart 7, this is a child who saw some of my previous videos and got salty because of what I said about 3DS Rainbow Road, which I just think is really funny. Like, I know they weren't trying to be funny, but the mental image of a 10-year-old getting mad over my opinions absolutely made my day when I first saw this. Anyways, as the finale of this track and its reviews, we have the return of the incredibly detailed reviewer, who gave this track 5 stars in the gameplay, visuals, and music departments, and said about the track, the longest track in the game to end the booster course pass in the best way possible. Wii Rainbow Road has been very unique and experimental since the original iteration, yet it does not mess up a single thing. The original really feels like the definitive Rainbow Road because it includes one iconic feature from each previous Rainbow Road: the brutal difficulty from SNES, the long duration from N64, the bounciness from GBA, the majestic appearance from GCN, and the roller coaster feeling from DS. On top of that, it includes Mario Kart Wii's new gimmick, Half Pipes, and it references Super Mario Galaxy through both visuals and music. The Mario Kart 8 Deluxe iteration is really good, and it kept and even improved all the iconic features, besides the difficulty. The visuals are absolutely stunning, and the music is top-tier video game OST. The online gameplay is even better than the original because the nerfed difficulty makes this track feel more fair when interacting with other players. It has a con I'll talk about later. Also, its long duration and the extra optional item set make sure all those boost panels do not feel overwhelming. In fact, this track can be bagged as well if you plan ahead very well. Front running after the beginning drafts is of course very good, but not overwhelming, straightforward and boring like the other two speed drafters in this game, Mute City and N64 Rainbow Road. Even if Wii Rainbow Road is not really that technical, all its features make it a track that rewards skill and planning ahead, which is uncommon for a speed-based track. And that's a really healthy and fun gameplay design. Nintendo could not have cooked better. Or maybe yes, just a little. They added too many unnecessary barriers, so it's too easy compared to the original iteration. I love the analysis on this one a lot. It's very well done and does justice to this incredible track. And that is the end of all that. Man, this all took way too long. But I'm really glad that it was an enjoyable time overall, and there were a lot of good tracks to talk about. I really do think that this is the strongest retro selection in the entire series for this reason, earning it a 9 out of 10 overall. There are numerous tracks that are fantastic upgrades beyond anything the series has seen before or since, and while there's also some pretty bad tracks with them, overall the average is still incredibly high compared to the rest of the franchise, and it's because of the massive amount of above average tracks there are in the selection. And with that, this video draws to a close. I know that this video is coming out a lot later than I originally hoped it would, but at least it's done now. If you must know, Yoshi's Island has absolutely atrocious Wi-Fi, and that's why it took so long, and it definitely didn't have anything to do with having a ton of classwork and a performance and a sickness, sometimes all at once. But, thanks for being here throughout this series. There's no way in hell I'm doing a 5th part for Mario Kart Tour because that qualifies as torture in the United States, and I'm going to be trying to get more content out in the near future as recompense to you guys for missing 2 months in a row. Maybe we'll have more information on the next Nintendo console and the next Mario Kart game soon. I don't know. I'll see y'all next time. What happened? Oh no. Ah, I can't read. I'm actually Pit from Kid Icarus. It's literally me. I can't read.